To God be the glory.
Welcome back to our study, Evidence for Christianity. In today's class, we're going to continue our discussion of the moral argument, but we're going to look at the topic of evil, pain, and suffering. You know that question, why is there evil, pain, and suffering in the world? For many, this question, it brings up issues of the existence of God. It's a stumbling block to come to a belief in God, or maybe even maintaining a solid faith. You know, every person who has ever lived or is living today has been impacted by all of these, by evil, by pain, by suffering. It is a reality of our world. And that's what we want to address. But is it, as the atheists have claimed, the proof that God does not exist? Well, that's what we're going to dive into and study in some consideration. Now, this topic is one that by its very nature carries a whole host of emotions. And I am not here to disregard your emotions. They are real. They're a part of your struggles. But I do want to ask this one thing. As we work through and discuss this universally important topic, that we take a few moments to try and separate the context for these concepts apart from our own emotions. You know, it's as if we are an advisor outside of the stressful event, and we are trying to give guidance that is unbiased by the emotional pressures. You probably understand that when you're in the middle of a stressful situation, your emotional state, sometimes dealing with everything around you and logically working through it and working through that process, sometimes it takes that helpful friend, that family member or loved one alongside you who comes in and being outside of the situation is able to give reasonable and wise counsel. I want us to put ourselves into that role. I know that evil and pain and suffering has so much emotion. And we think back to the events in our lives that have molded us, but have also impacted us. And sometimes it's hard to pull ourselves away and to think consistently and reasonably through the issue. But I'm going to ask that of you today. All right. Now, as we get started, we mentioned that this is one of atheists' biggest arguments against God's existence, and also one of the stumbling blocks that people have. So if we think about how an atheist would practically state their argument against God, here's a couple of ways. Number one, a good God would not allow so much evil in the world. All right? A good God would not allow evil, and evil maybe to the degree that we're seeing, right? That would be their claim. And so God couldn't exist because we have so much evil. All right, number two, an all-powerful God would stop suffering from happening. All right? This second one looks at not the goodness or the love and the benevolence of God, but instead looks at the power of God and talks about that a powerful God would stop suffering from happening. All right. Now those are some practical statements. Let's put it maybe in a little bit more formal sense. And some of these arguments go back millennia, go back before the time that Christ walked on this earth. Here's one of those ways that the argument is phrased. If God is all loving, but will not stop evil, then He is not all good. All right? If God is all loving, but will not stop evil, He's not all good. Number two, if God is all powerful but cannot stop suffering, well, then He is not really all powerful. All right, let's think about these arguments that the atheists have brought up, all right, how they are framed and how they are fashioned. First off, they are drawing from aspects of God, His power, and they're drawing His love, omnipotence and omnibenevolence. Now that really is drawing and connecting to the God of the Bible. You see, there are other religions with one God or a variety of gods, but even their God does not have these characteristics. We've talked about both of these characteristics when we observe the world around us. Cosmological argument, the design argument, and even our first lesson on the moral argument, we saw that God had to be all-powerful, and that through morality had to be all-loving. All right, so the atheist has recognized that, has recognized it as an aspect of deity, an aspect that has to be there, and an aspect that Christianity has central to its message. All right, we're going to look at this phrase or this concept, the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. And we're going to think about each of those cases and give a response. All right, we've got three different terms, categories into our discussion. First off, evil. Let's give a response to evil. You know, by recognizing the existence of evil, you are also recognizing a contrast of good. Now remember back when we talked about the moral argument, if we could establish that there is an objective standard, if we could critique an action or behavior as evil, well then we are connecting to something that is above us. It is that objective standard, a contrast that works for us, but works for all of humanity. If an atheist is looking at it and saying, because there is so much evil in the world, there can't be a God. Well, if we separate ourselves from the emotional aspect of that, how are you calling it evil? Well, you contrast it with the opposite behavior. You contrast it with good. Far from using evil to prove God, we're establishing that there is a contrast of goodness and that evil exists in comparison to it. So we are critiquing and we are considering the fact that there is an objective moral law that we're relating to. I want to read for you a quote by C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist, and in this quote he talks about his conversion, his transition from atheism to theism, and this moral argument and evil and good was central to that thought. All right, so listen here. My argument, he says, against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Notice what he's looking at and saying. He's recognizing that he was confronted with evil and it bothered him. And thinking about the goodness of God, but seeing a world that had evil, it frustrated him maybe, but it also confused him. But when he separated himself from some of that emotional stress of the situation, and he began to look at it, he realized that in other places, I look at a line, and I only can call it crooked if I know what a straight line is. Well, that same idea of comparing two things, of looking at something and saying, that is unjust. Well, how do you know it's unjust unless you know what justice looks like? How is it evil unless you know what good is? All right? What a great recognition in his life to make that transition. All right, so a response to evil. Now, it doesn't take away evil from the world, but it does say when we see it, we only know that it exists because we know goodness. And we know that there is a moral standard, things that are right, things that are universally good. And so it gives to us an idea of we have to understand where that contrast even came from. All right, now thinking about a second response, a response to pain, the topic of pain. For pain to be an argument against God's existence, it must be shown that pain is contrary to God. Okay, so we ask the question, is pain objectively evil? Is pain always wrong, immoral, evil, bad? Is it not beneficial? Okay, that would make it in contrast and contrary to God and His existence. All right? If pain can be beneficial at any time, then it's not objectively evil, and therefore it's not against God. All right? So we ask that question and we think about it. We think, can pain be beneficial? Well, sometimes we experience pain. Let's think about that for a moment. We experience pain in our life, and sometimes that pain is of a physical nature. Sometimes that pain is fever, coughs and colds. Sometimes it's aches in our body or pain in a region of our body that's not normal. Well, when we go to the doctor and we get some of our physical makeup checked out, what do they call that? Well, they call it a symptom, right? You came in. What are your symptoms? What are you experiencing? And so you begin to outline it. Well, and that doctor then is working through those points of pain, right? If you didn't have them, he would have no place to go. He doesn't know what hurts. He doesn't know what's wrong. He doesn't know where to even address an issue. But instead, when you tell him, my foot hurts, my side hurts, I've had a fever for 2 or 3 days, he begins to realize where's that source coming from? And you know what? So often the case is that the symptom, what you experience on the surface, that pain, really that is a marker for something deeper, a marker for something that is much more significant, could be a longer-term issue. But by going in, by having those first inklings of pain, those first few symptoms, by going in, you now have the opportunity to get your deeper problem addressed. Was pain beneficial in that case? Yes. You know, sometimes we take our children or we go in ourselves and we get a shot or we get poked with a needle. We get blood drawn out so that they can test it and see what might be going on. Is that a joyous event? Is that a happy event? Is that something that is pleasant? No, it's temporary pain. We allow ourselves, in many cases, to experience temporary pain so that we can benefit long term. All right, sometimes we even set ourselves up. We choose to put ourselves in a place where we will experience pain, not for our benefit, not for our future health, but for the benefit of others. Sometimes we make choices, and those choices bring pain on us physically, maybe even emotionally and mentally, but we have chosen to do it because we know it brings somebody else joy. It brings somebody else a benefit that they need in their life, and we think our decreasing is good for their increasing at this moment. You know, some pain, though, it's not beneficial. It's caused by the evil actions of others. All right? So it is not a problem necessarily in this case. Sometimes we experience pain, right, from others impacting us in some evil way, but that's really not a problem with pain itself, right? We're responding to the question of pain. That's not really with pain because there's another cause, there's another action being invoked here, and we have another party participating in it. And so that gives us a response to pain. Now let's turn and think about our response to suffering. For suffering to be an argument against God's existence in general, it must be shown that suffering is also contrary to God. Just like we talked about with pain, we ask the question, is suffering objectively evil? All right? So when we say that, we're saying that all suffering, by its very nature, is evil. It's immoral. It is against an all-powerful and all-loving God. But if we can look at suffering and find that some suffering can be beneficial at any time, then it's not objectively evil, and it is therefore not against God. All right, so let's ask that question and think. Can suffering be beneficial? Think about your own life. We just talked about some circumstances dealing with pain, and that might be more of a physical response. Suffering, sometimes we think about it more of a mental or emotional response. But let's think about it. Is there some suffering that can be beneficial? Well, suffering the consequences of your own poor decisions. All right? Sometimes we make decisions that are not wise. They're not beneficial. They're not what we should have done. Maybe they're not sin or against a commandment of God, but they're just unwise. What do we gain when we experience that suffering? We experience the uncomfortableness, maybe some guilt that we should have done something different. That gives to us a correction. Do we learn from those? Will you make that same mistake in the future? Well, I think you'll remember back to that suffering. Again, not even necessarily physical, like we are touching a hot oven and we're burned and we won't do that again. No, it's making a choice that we see brings to us sadness, brings to us a state of mind that is not happy and joyous. The next time that we encounter that same situation, what will our response be? Well, it will be to choose the wise course, right? The course that brings benefit and happiness, one that gives us confidence that we're doing what's right. Oh, so the suffering of that moment in your past actually helped correct where you went in the future. Okay, so for your life, your poor decision at one moment in time was actually beneficial long term. Think about if you had never received, you never felt bad. You made a decision and nothing was wrong. Everything seemed happy with it. Well, the next time it comes around, you'll make that same decision because that seems natural. Well, poor decisions can be corrected. Suffering, again, similar to the choice in pain, where sometimes we choose to take a little pain in our lives so that somebody else doesn't. The same is true for suffering. We think about the mental anguish, emotional, psychological anguish that somebody might go through. For us to step in knowing that, hey, we have the ability, we have the talent, we have the confidence right now that if I take a little bit of this anguish and I help take a load off of my friend, my loved one, my spouse, that I am bringing a benefit to them far greater than the little bit of suffering that I'm getting. Well, that again is a benefit. It's not evil to do that. It's good. It's beneficial for your relationship on a first level, and then it's just beneficial to yourself to know that you choose good and you're not selfish. And so when we think about suffering, all suffering is not objectively evil. So it's not an argument against God in and of itself. But let's take it one step further. Let's think about suffering that maybe is useless. Somebody might describe it as pointless. It's needless suffering. And oftentimes, because of what we've just discussed, through evil, through pain, and through some of suffering, oftentimes the atheist changes their tact and draws back and says, okay, yeah, good and contrast of good and evil, and some pain is good, but really there's this gratuitous, right? There's this over-the-top suffering that humanity has that is just pointless and useless and serves no need. Okay? Let's think about that and address that for a moment. first question, who decides useless or pointless? You know, we're restricted to our immediate surroundings. Whatever's here, the context, the point in time that we are living, we're restricted to that. And so when we look at something, our evaluation is right there on the surface with what we see and what surrounds us. But if you'll think back to when you were a child, when you were younger, there were things that in your context you thought, this is pointless, right? This is useless. Why am I being asked to do this? Why are my parents telling me that I have to do this? Why are authorities or school or structure or laws, why is any of this? Because in my moment, it doesn't serve a purpose in my mind. Okay, now I'm not saying that atheists are children. But what I'm saying is that there's a context that we need to recognize our limitations. We're restricted to what's around us. So the question comes, is there something outside of our situation for which this suffering plays a role? Is there something beyond what we can see in the current moment where this suffering plays a part? That this suffering maybe is helping me in the future? We don't know that yet. Is this suffering really, it's going to help somebody else? Maybe I didn't choose to bring it into my life, but when everything plays out and all is said and done, I look back and I go, you know what? There was something that came out of it. All right? So that question of who gets to decide, who gets to discern what is useless or pointless in regards to suffering, especially when we come into the aspect of thinking about God's existence. When we say something is useless or pointless and that there is all of this suffering, so much that it says that there is no God in all of creation, above all of creation. Well, we have essentially placed ourselves into that role of deity, where we are saying we see and understand not just everything here, but everything through time, forward and backwards. That's not a place that we want to find ourselves, putting ourselves in the place of deity. It doesn't answer all the questions, but it does give to us a perspective for where we are. And so that brings us to this question of, why do we suffer? You know, we started off this class saying that pain and suffering is universal. It impacts everybody. You have it in your life. I have it in my life. Why do we suffer? Okay, I want to give you a few reasons to think about. Maybe not exhaustive, but just a few. Number one, free will. Freedom of choice. You know, a fundamental aspect of humanity's creation is that we have free will. And sometimes we suffer because humans, right, you and I, we have this freedom to make our own choices. Now, we see that from the very earliest pages of Scripture there in Genesis, that free will was given to humanity, but it came with responsibility. When we make a choice, there are consequences. Sometimes those consequences are good, and sometimes those consequences are bad. Sometimes they're beneficial. Sometimes they bring to us joy and contentment, but other choices bring us suffering. But you know what? We have free will, and that is across all of humanity. It's not just you that has free will, making your own choices and somebody else doesn't. Everybody has free will. And that brings to us our second point. Why do we suffer? Because of our personal choices. These consequences of the free will that God gave to us, of the free will that exists in our universe, which we see. You know what? If you choose to smoke or drink, there are consequences to your health. If you take anything, drink or food, drugs, smoking, whatever it is, if you consume something into your body, well, your body's going to have consequences to that, right? If you decide to disregard wise counsel, right? That friend who is outside of the stressful situation, who's trying to give you good advice, if you disregard it, well then very likely negative consequences and suffering are coming your way. You see, we have choices to make. You know, in the Bible, in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, we find a reference talking about our choices. In verse 15 it reads, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters." All right? Peter, writing to Christians, what is he saying? He's saying you can make choices. Free moral agency. You're a free person. You can make choices, but those choices, murdering, stealing, being an evildoer, gossiping and inserting yourself into other people's matters and their lives and disrupting things, if you make those choices, you may suffer. And Peter is saying, make a better choice, right? Peter's being that wise counsel. Through inspiration of God, he is saying, here is a wise way to conduct yourselves. Don't be a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or a busybody. We don't want you to encounter suffering. But then notice in verse 16 of that passage, he says, "Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter." Okay? If you have chosen, your personal choice has been good, well then you should feel confidence. You should not be ashamed. You should glorify God that your suffering is related to choosing good, to being moral. And that brings to us our third reason. Why do we suffer? The choices of others. You know, our personal choices can bring suffering to us, but you know what? Our personal choices can bring suffering to others. Think about that. The choices that you make, when you make a choice that is immoral or evil, to do something illegal, dangerous, reckless, what you do may bring suffering to you, but more than likely it's going to affect many others around you with suffering because you have chosen to engage in behavior that is not beneficial even to others. And that dangerous aspect, that recklessness, is going to spill over into other people's lives. Being the innocent party, though, we can still receive the impact of unwise or immoral behavior of others. All right? If you make the immoral decision, you can impact others. But even being in a place of innocence, choosing good things, some of those immoral decisions of others spill over into your life. Drugs and alcohol, illegal activities, these are common reasons that multitudes of people suffer because of one decision. Well, that's why we have laws. That's why we have structure. That's why we have communities. That's why we have our culture and our family and those that surround us, because we want to help them. We want to be blessed by them, but we have to realize free will, right? Freedom of choice is going to enter into the equation, and if we make a bad choice, if they make a bad choice, suffering can be part of the equation. All right? Extending that a little bit, we bring up our fourth reason. Why do we suffer? Past generations. All right? Similar to the suffering caused by the choices of others, this reason addresses long-standing consequences. You know, sometimes caused by unwise or immoral decisions, things that are rash, things that are not fully evaluated, they impact the current time, but some of them may last for years, if not generations. We think about some of the immoral decisions by world leaders. And we can just look back in history and see various empires and countries and world leaders who, because of their decisions, have impacted whole societies and subsequent generations. All right? Also, maybe not immoral decisions, but maybe things that are not fully evaluated, some unwise uses of even physical materials. Decades ago, there was a substance known as asbestos. And this substance was a wonderful insulator, right? Keeping heat in or keeping cool in, heat out. A wonderful insulator. It was virtually fireproof. Humanity put it into buildings and into factories, put it into ships and other places. But we found out not long afterwards that it has a very negative impact on our health, inducing lung cancer and breathing issues. All right, think about pesticides. At times we are trying to grow our crops to feed our country, to feed our family, our city. And so sometimes we develop a chemical that keeps bugs away and our fruit is able to grow to its maturity, nice and plump and full, and we get a great harvest. But you know what? If we have run through the process too quickly, and we haven't fully evaluated what's the impact that this new substance, which seems to bring all this benefit, what does it have in its benefit or issues ongoing? But you know what? We also benefit from past generations. We have technology, technological advances that have brought to us good things. And we benefit from running water. We benefit from electricity. We benefit from being able to communicate in an instant around the world. So we take both good and bad from the freedom of choice of past generations. All right, now our fifth one. Why do we suffer? Well, because of natural laws. Sometimes we suffer from the consequences of the natural world around us. Physical laws can result in suffering. Sometimes we think that we can jump higher, run faster, climb higher than maybe our physical bodies really could. And, gravity, it can hurt. When you fall from a large height, you're going to experience some suffering. Electricity is wonderful, right? Giving us lights and power, heat and cold inside our homes day and night. But it's also quite painful to get electrocuted or to get a shock, and it can even be deadly. The natural laws and the phenomena that around us, they can also cause devastation and suffering in large scale. Hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes, landslides, wildfires, all of these natural phenomena, they can bring devastation. And so the question is, should God suspend the laws of nature anytime there's suffering? Well, that would reason against God's existence, right? We've already talked about the cosmological and the design argument where we looked at regularity and consistency for God's existence. And so to take all that away would then start to speak against God. So in summary, as we close our lesson today, I want us to think about three lessons that we can learn. Number one, the standard is recognized. The standard is recognized because this claim of evil, pain, and suffering brings to mind the moral argument, good and evil. How can you, as an atheist, call this evil? Because you have no standard of good to base it upon. Number two, the source recognized. Free will undermines or undergirds every reasoning that we were discussing, that it brings about responsibility with the choices that we make, what we do, what others do, what past generations have done. There are sources and reasons for our suffering. And last, a lesson that we can learn. What is the solution? Do atheists want God to remove all suffering? Do they want it to take it away off the board, off the table entirely? Well, we've already talked about suffering brings good benefits. Maybe not at the time, and maybe not for a while, but long term, very likely it does. So do atheists want suffering to be completely removed? And then the question, well, where is God when we suffer, right? That's the question so often in our minds when we are in the moment, when our emotions have consumed us. Where is God? It's a reasonable question, but we need to understand the solution. God has promised to take away all pain and suffering. Now, It's His time frame and not ours, and it's not on this earth. He says in heaven that will be the case, pain and suffering taken away. And where is God when we suffer? Well, He's in the same place that He was when Jesus Christ suffered, not because of His choices, but because of the world's free will to sin. And so God was there, knowing that the suffering of His Son was for your benefit. Thank you for joining us. Please come back for our next class.